This is still unanswered. I'm Mara Ellison. Today, the Eastburn family murders, a suburban house, a dog ad, 3 trials, and a DNA match that would ultimately pull a man off the street and back onto military rolls decades later. It's a case that feels solved and unresolved at the same time. And we're going to sit in that uncomfortable space for the next hour, because what we do with that discomfort matters. Let's begin where the story begins. A quiet neighborhood in Fayetteville, North Carolina, Mother's Day weekend, 1985. Gary and Katie Eastburn, both in their early 30s, 3 little girls, preparing for a move to England, and Dixie, their English setter, who couldn't make the trip. Katie places a small ad to rehome the dog. That small ad becomes the hinge of everything that follows.
Mara, just to anchor listeners who aren't familiar with military life, Fort Bragg and Pope Air Force Base are filled with families who live on base-adjacent streets. It's intimate. Soldiers and airmen trust each other. So the idea of answering a dog ad, visiting the home, doesn't sound like anything out of the ordinary. It's a mundane interaction. That mundanity is important to remember.
Right. And on May 7, 1985, a sergeant named Timothy Hennis answers the ad. He meets Katie, meets the children, takes the dog home that day. According to his own account, that's it. One contact, a follow-up phone call a couple days later. But in the small world of that subdivision, that single interaction is enough to later tie him to the Eastburns in a way that will upend many lives.
When you look at the timeline, the murders occur sometime the night of May 9 into the early morning of May 10. Neighbors later describe odd stillness. A janitor, Patrick Cohn, reports seeing a tall white man carrying a trash bag, wearing a knit cap and a black members-only jacket, leaving the Eastburn driveway around 3:30 a.m. He gets into a white Chevrolet Chevette. That sighting becomes crucial.
By Sunday, May 12, neighbors are worried. Newspapers piled up, no activity. They go in. The scene inside the Eastburn home is tragic beyond words. Katie and 2 of her daughters, Kara and Erin, are dead. Baby Jana, barely 2, is alive but critically dehydrated. We don't linger on the gore here. We focus on the loss and the way this scene propels a police investigation into single-mindedness.
It's worth pausing. The Cumberland County detectives, Robert Biddle and Jack Watts, collect a lot of evidence. They find semen on a vaginal swab from Katie, assorted hairs, fingerprints, signs of a cleanup in the bathroom. But forensic technology in 1985 couldn't do the DNA testing we take for granted today. So investigators are left with physical clues they can't yet tie conclusively to a person.
And then there's Cohn's identification. He helps create a composite sketch. When Hennis sees the sketch and the publicity about the dog, he walks into the sheriff's office on May 15 and gives blood, saliva, hair, fingerprints. He's arrested that same day. From there, the case races forward. A first trial, a conviction, a death sentence in 1986.
The prosecution's theory in 1986. Hennis returned to the Eastburn house after the dog drop-off, made unwanted sexual advances toward Katie, and then killed her and the 2 older girls when she resisted. The state leans heavily on eyewitness identification, ATM withdrawals using Katie's card in the aftermath, and circumstantial ties. Dry cleaning of a jacket, burning of items, late-night visits. It's an emotional, powerful narrative for a jury.
And an important legal note here. In 1986, the state did not have DNA tying him to the semen, so the case that sent Hennis to death row was largely circumstantial, though the circumstantial fabric was persuasive to a jury. He turned down plea offers, he insisted on his innocence. The bottom line, guilty verdict, death sentence by the state.
But this is where the story takes an unusual turn. In 1988, the North Carolina Supreme Court reverses the conviction, citing concerns about prejudicial evidence, particularly the graphic crime scene photos shown at trial and other trial errors. That reversal leads to a retrial in 1989 in a different county. And at that retrial, the defense is much better prepared.
Right. And in 1989, the second jury acquits Hennis of all charges. He walks out a free man. He goes back into the Army. He rebuilds a life, promoted, family life, work. To many, especially after a 1993 book called Innocent Victims and a 1996 TV miniseries, he becomes a symbol of a wrongful conviction overturned. The public narrative is powerful. The wrong man was accused, justice was done.
Which is why the next development, years later, feels seismic. Around 2005, Captain Larry Trotter, a sheriff's investigator, revisits the case and learns that the semen sample from Katie still exists. He sends it for modern DNA testing to the state crime lab. And in June 2006, the DNA match comes back, statistically astronomic. The lab reports the profile is about 1.2 quadrillion times more likely to be from Timothy Hennis than from a random person.
That number, 1.2 quadrillion, it's the kind of thing that juries and prosecutors call near certain. When you hear it, your instinct is to say, end of story. But Daniel, you and I both know these numbers don't stand alone in the courtroom. Forensic certainty can be isolated from contextual reality. What does dual sovereignty do next?
Dual sovereignty is the legal doctrine that allows two different sovereigns, in this case the state of North Carolina and the federal military sovereign, to prosecute the same conduct without violating the double jeopardy clause. Because Hennis had been acquitted in state court, he could not be retried by the state. But the military saw an opening. In a highly unusual move, the Army recalled Hennis, who'd retired in 2004, to active duty so he could be court-martialed. That raised eyebrows, ethically and legally.
Let's pause on that. Recalling a retired soldier specifically to try him for a crime already litigated and acquitted in civilian courts, that's jarring. Some see it as a necessary route to justice for a brutal crime. Others view it as an end run around an acquittal. The moral ambiguity here is thick.
It is. The Army court-martial began in March 2010 at Fort Bragg. The prosecution, led by Army attorneys, made DNA the foundation of their case. He left one thing at the scene he couldn't clean up: his sperm, one prosecutor said. They argued the DNA tied Hennis to the assault and enabled them to fill in the rest with those older circumstantial pieces we talked about.
And the defense? They pushed a few lines of attack. One of the most controversial was the consensual sex theory, that the semen could be explained by a prior consensual encounter between Katie and Hennis, which, by the way, Hennis denied outright. So the defense was arguing, in effect, that he might have had consensual sex with a woman he insists he never had sex with. That's awkward, and frankly, a tough narrative to sell to a jury.
They also raised concerns about contamination and lab error. And that was not a frivolous argument because, around that time, the North Carolina SBI crime lab had come under scrutiny for flawed reports in other cases. Defense attorneys argued that decades-old evidence could have been mishandled, contaminated, or misinterpreted. They also pointed to the physical evidence gap, notably male DNA under the victim's fingernails that did not match Hennis.
Let's linger on that for a moment. Male DNA under the fingernails of the victims that doesn't match Hennis. If a single perpetrator stabbed the victims in a bloody struggle, why would there be male DNA not matching the man whose semen is inside the female victim? That contradiction fuels the sense, for some listeners, maybe for you, for me, that the case still has real unanswered parts.
It does. The defense also leaned on the point that a killer in that kind of violent, blood-soaked scene would likely be covered in blood and leave traces, hairs, fibers, blood, in his car or home. The original 1985 searches didn't find anything conclusively linking Hennis physically to the crime scene. So you have this tension, overwhelming DNA in one evidenciary category and a striking absence in many others.
The court-martial panel deliberated for only about 3 hours and returned a guilty verdict on April 3, 2010. On April 15th, he was sentenced to death and demoted to Private E1. Hennis was moved to Fort Leavenworth's military prison. But even after that conviction, questions remained, legal and moral, scientific and human.
One such question is, was it appropriate for the military to assert jurisdiction? Under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the military has authority over its members, and the dual sovereignty doctrine permits separate prosecutions. But Mara, many scholars and defense advocates asked, is it fair to resurrect prosecution after a civilian acquittal, especially when technology had changed dramatically?
Fairness is the right word. Another live issue is lab reliability. After the 2010 conviction, the defense pushed for new proceedings, pointing to issues at the SBI lab and to particular analysts who had been under scrutiny. There were motions for new trials, requests for extensive discovery. Some of those requests were denied by the military judge. Appeals and legal skirmishes followed.
And so, where do we sit now? Hennis remains under sentence of death by the military, appeals ongoing. The North Carolina state system is functionally finished with the case because of double jeopardy. But the story continues to echo. In the Eastburn family, in the defense bar, in debates about dual sovereignty and forensic reliance.
I want to turn now to the human cost. Gary Eastburn lost his wife and 2 daughters in a single night. Their surviving child, Jana, grew up without her mother and sisters. Decades later, Gary spoke in interviews with a kind of measured exhaustion. The legal series of events, conviction, acquittal, military trial, conviction again, didn't ease the grief. It complicated it.
There's a line I often think about in cases like this. The law seeks answers, but the families seek closure. Those are not always the same thing. For the Eastburns, a conviction, any conviction, offers a certain kind of closure. But the competing facts, the unanswered forensic anomalies, and the legal contortions make closure partial at best.
Let's step back and list the core unresolved tensions so listeners can weigh them. 1. DNA evidence, sperm on Katie's body, matches Hennis with astronomical probability. 2. Other forensic traces typically expected in a violent, bloody assault, blood, hairs, fibers, linking a suspect to the scene, are absent from his home and car. 3. Male DNA under fingernails doesn't match Hennis. 4. Eyewitness identification in 1985 and 1986, primarily Patrick Cohn, has been criticized for reliability. 5. an anonymous letter claiming responsibility lands the day of Hennis's sentencing in 1986. 6. The military's recall of Hennis raises ethical questions about double jeopardy values.
That's a succinct summary, Mara. Each of those tensions has plausible explanations. For example, absence of blood or hairs could be due to a killer changing clothes, cleaning, or transferring via other means. The unmatched nail DNA could belong to an accomplice or to secondary transfer. Eyewitness error is well documented and can be influenced by media. The anonymous letter could be a hoax. But plausible isn't proof, and the sum of these plausible alternatives keeps reasonable doubt alive in many minds.
Exactly. And this is the brand of doubt still unanswered is meant to hold up. Not necessarily to exonerate, not necessarily to convict, but to examine where certainty is deserved and where it's provisional. So let's unpack two big legal concepts that carried the weight of this case: double jeopardy and dual sovereignty.
Double jeopardy, under the Fifth Amendment, prevents someone from being tried twice by the same sovereign for the same offense. But the dual sovereignty doctrine treats state and federal, or in this case, state and military charges, as brought by separate sovereigns, because they punish distinct offenses under different codes. Practically, that means an acquittal in state court doesn't bar a prosecution in federal or military court for the same conduct. It's been controversial for decades and has produced heated debate in legal scholarship.
Philosophically, people ask, if a jury has already said not guilty, should another sovereign get to try again just because the Constitution permits it? The counterargument is victims and their families deserve justice, and if one sovereign declines or fails to achieve a result, another might pursue it based on different legal tools. It's not an easy balance.
And practically, the dual sovereignty doctrine can be used in ways that feel like forum shopping. In Hennis's case, the military had authority precisely because he was still a former service member and could be recalled. That's rare. Most people aren't subject to two sovereigns with such ready jurisdictional reach.
The other big piece here is how we interpret DNA. For many jurors, a DNA match with a 1.2 quadrillion statistic is the final word. But forensic science sits inside a chain: collection, storage, analysis, interpretation. In Hennis's case, the sample was decades old. The SBI lab later faced criticism for sloppy practices in other matters. So we must ask, how do we weigh a seemingly overwhelming DNA statistic against potential lab issues and the other missing evidence?
One helpful way to think about it: DNA is a highly persuasive linkage between a person and a physical act, in this case, sexual contact. It doesn't by itself prove identity as the murderer unless contextual factors make it improbable the contact was consensual and unrelated to murder. The presence of an unmatched male DNA under fingernails complicates an otherwise tidy narrative. For a juror, that missing piece might generate reasonable doubt. For another juror, the DNA fill-in might be decisive.
Let's bring this back to the victims. People sometimes get lost in legal doctrines and numbers and forget there are a mom and two little girls gone. The surviving daughter, Jana, and Gary Eastburn carry that grief. When we talk about justice in this case, we have to acknowledge that no verdict returns what was lost. It only addresses culpability and accountability. That's a cold consolation, and listeners should sit with that.
I agree. And in my years as a JAG officer and in military courts, I've seen the system struggle to carry both evidence and empathy. The rules are technical, but the outcomes feel moral. Defense attorneys raise doubt, prosecutors seek truth as they see it, and families, they want answers and closure. Sometimes the law provides one measure of closure, sometimes it gives more questions.
Now, I want to address the letter we mentioned, the anonymous confession that arrived the day Hennis was first sentenced in 1986. It's a mysterious artifact. Was it the real killer? A prank? Someone with inside knowledge? For decades, it's been a tantalizing, unresolved thread. Investigators could never tie it to anyone credible. How do you weigh an anonymous post-conviction letter in a case like this?
Letters like that are, more often than not, hoaxes or attention-seeking. But occasionally they do carry value. The problem is that unless the author can be identified and their claims corroborated, such letters are weak evidence. In court, they're often excluded or given little weight. They serve more, psychologically, to needle doubt into public perception.
Another angle, the way the initial investigation may have narrowed on Hennis once he became a suspect. Critics say once police fixed on him, partly because he answered a dog ad and then walked into the station, other leads might have been given less attention. That's a criticism raised in many investigations where momentum and media pressure close the investigative aperture too quickly.
That's an important investigative lesson. Confirmation bias can creep into criminal investigations. Once someone is labeled the suspect, behaviors, sightings, and forensic interpretation can bend toward proving that narrative. Good investigators constantly re-examine leads that might point elsewhere. The question in Hennis's case is whether that re-examination happened thoroughly enough in 1985 and in the years that followed.
And yet, law enforcement did preserve evidence, the vaginal swab, that decades later would be tested. That preservation speaks to good practice. It allowed modern methods to speak to old evidence. But preservation alone doesn't resolve the contradictions we've discussed.
Mara, one more technical point worth raising. The statistical language used in DNA reports can be misleading to non-experts. Saying a profile is 1.2 quadrillion times more likely to Hennis than a random person is a population statistic comparison. It doesn't factor in the prior probability, that is, the baseline likelihood someone like Hennis committed the crime. Jurors often interpret the statistic as absolute proof because it sounds so precise.
Right, and that's where context matters. The statistic can be devastating in a vacuum, but evidence never arrives in a vacuum. It arrives amid witness statements, physical evidence patterns, and known behaviors. This case shows how powerful DNA can be, and how it can also be misleading if divorced from corroboration.
Let's pause for a moment. I want to ask you directly, Mara. After working wrongful conviction beats and watching military prosecutions, what do you feel when you sit with the Eastburn case?
It's complicated, Daniel. On one hand, the DNA match is compelling and points to someone who was in close physical contact with Katie at or near the time of her death. That matters. On the other hand, the absence of corroborating physical traces, the unmatched nail DNA, the shaky eyewitness ID, those create a persistent shadow of doubt. And beyond evidence, the legal maneuvers, recalling a retired man to active duty, lean into questions about fairness. I sympathize deeply with the Eastburn family's desire for finality. I also feel moral unease about the idea that an acquittal can be circumvented by the machinery of another sovereign. It's a real moral thicket.
I share that unease. In military justice, we strive to be precise, to meet high standards. And yet, the dual sovereignty option is sometimes the only path to prosecute where the state declined or was barred by double jeopardy. The legal path can feel both principled and uneasy, depending on where you stand. I respect the family's need for answers, and I respect the defendant's right not to be subject to perpetual state action. There's a tension there that the law doesn't resolve neatly.
Before we move to close, let's give listeners a sense of what remains today. Timothy Hennis remains under a military death sentence with appeals ongoing. The state-level avenue is closed. For many observers, the matter is closed. For many others, particularly those focused on forensic nuance, there are lingering uncertainties. And the Eastburn family continues to live with loss that no verdict can erase.
For lawyers and investigators listening, the case offers lessons. Preserve evidence even when technology is primitive. Be wary of confirmation bias. Handle eyewitnesses with care. And remember that DNA is powerful but not automatically dispositive. For the broader public, it raises civic questions about how we structure justice and whether our doctrines match our ethical intuitions. For the broader service members, it raises civic questions about how we structure justice and whether our doctrines match our ethical intuitions.
So we come back to our central question. If DNA says this is our guy, why does this case still feel so deeply unresolved? The short answer is because DNA answered one question only: who deposited semen on Katie Eastburn, and did not, by itself, answer every other question we have about how that night unfolded, who else might have been involved, and whether investigative or lab errors could distort that answer.
And the longer answer is, criminal cases are mosaics. A single bright blue tile, like a compelling DNA match, can draw the eye, but you still need the rest of the picture to know what's really depicted. In the Eastburn case, some tiles are clear and sharp. Others are blurred or missing. That leaves us sitting with discomfort, and perhaps that's where we should be.
For the Eastburn family, for Gary, for Jana, the legal turns have not returned the life they were robbed of. For Timothy Hennis and his family, the back and forth has been life-defining. And for the system, this case tests our trust in forensic science, in judicial doctrines, and in the idea that the law can deliver final answers to violent, messy human tragedies. We'll put resources for further reading in the episode notes, court documents, reporting, and some of the critiques of the SBI lab. If you want to dig deeper, those links will help. Daniel, any final words before we wrap?
Just this. When you listen to cases like this, try to hold two things at once. Hold compassion for victims and families. That matters. And hold a critical view of the evidence and institutions involved. Both compassion and skepticism can coexist. Both are necessary if we want a justice system that's not only resolute, but also reflective.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you for listening. This case lives inside a web of evidence and ethics, and it reminds us how uneasy answers can be. If you have thoughts, if you want to point us to documents or witnesses we should interview, reach out. We'll keep asking, because some things demand persistent questions. Next week on Still Unanswered, we look at a forensic scientist whose testimony altered multiple cases, and the ripple effects when expertise goes unchecked. Until then, sit with the uncertainty. Good night.